Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here. Thanks for inviting me for volunteering for the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what I do. I think we do not have many archaeologists in the university, and I think I'm the only maritime one in the university. So today, what I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of background on the discipline and also how I have come to use that background to actually address the climate crisis that we're experiencing today. So let's see if I can change the slide. Here we go. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of maritime archaeology because it's quite interesting and kind of defined the type of research that we do. I'm going to talk about the methodology and practice that we use, and this will lead me in explaining of how all this background has actually been extremely useful in responding to the climate emergency and how maritime archaeological studies have kind of jumped into working with climate resilience and climate adaptation, mostly because of all these tools and techniques and methodologies that we have been using. So I don't know if anyone has ever heard of archaeology, but for those that you don't know, archaeology is basically the discipline that studies human activity through the analysis of the material culture. So what we do is look at the material remains that has been left behind by previous civilizations, and we try to track how these people lived in particular environments. So unlike what you might have seen in Indiana Jones, we actually go through the soil and try to study people's trash and things left behind. And archaeology in general as a discipline has quite deep colonial roots, and it has started as a colonial practice, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Mediterranean. We had the movement of European antiquarians who had interested in collecting antiquities from especially the places where the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations previously lived. So a lot of them were having big trips in the Mediterranean, and during that time they were collecting important material remains that they thought would be good for their collections. But some of them, because a lot also had some academic background, started actually trying to study them and try to understand how this material remains could actually explain how people lived in the past. So very soon in the 19th century and towards the end of the 19th century, and of course in the beginning of the 20th century, we start having some more academic ways of studying the past and the material remains of the past. And that happened because archaeology got incorporated in a lot of European universities, especially in the northwest of Europe. And they started actually trying to see how they can scientifically record the past through material remains. And a lot of these universities created foreign schools in the various countries and places that they were interested in, including Greece, that I have as an example here, but also Italy and various countries of the Near East. And they basically tried to find a methodology that would be objective and also could allow people to systematically understand what happened rather than simply expressing opinions. So by the let's say the 1930s or before the Second World War, we do have academic archaeology happening in a very scientific way in many places in the world. However, that was not the case for maritime archaeology. And this is simply because the watery environments were inaccessible to humans for quite some time. So maritime archaeology started from underwater. And there were some antiquarians, similarly to the ones that I presented before for the Grand Tour, who were interested in looking at material remains who were underwater. But of course, the access to the underwater environment was very, very limited. And for that, they used things like diving helmets and diving bells, which were very dangerous. But we have, for example, in the 19th century, the Dean brothers, who were maritime antiquarians here in the UK, and they went around England trying to find basically wrecks that were reported in historical documents, and one of them was the Mary Rose, the famous Tudor ship that they found. They found the site of that wreck off the coast of Portsmouth in the Solent in southern England. And there's also other people in Central Europe, like Count Adolf von Morlot, who started collecting antiquities from the Lake Geneva in the late 19th century. And suddenly, we have some archaeological projects happening quite by chance in the early 20th century. But again, it did not involve archaeologists going underwater and systematically recording material. And this is again because we do not have the appropriate equipment. And one of the first shipwrecks that was had some sort of archaeological direction was the excavation of the Antikythera shipwreck that was found in the 1900s off the coast of the island of Antikythera in Greece. It was found by sponge divers who were Greek sponge divers who were actually fishing off the coast of Libya, and they were on their way back to the Aegean Sea in Greece, and they got caught up in a storm. So while they were waiting, they went underwater to fish some sponges, but instead they started finding a lot of bronze and marble sculptures. And once they started understanding what that was, they informed the Greek authorities. So the Greek government, with the help of the Greek Navy, decided that this is of archaeological importance. So they sent some archaeologists on board to direct how the sponge divers removed sculptures from underwater. And something similar happened with the shipwreck of Madia that was found in Tunisia in 1907. And again, the Tunisian authorities did something similar. They had archaeologists on ships and they directed how the sponge divers kind of like salvaged the material from the seabed. So again, on land in the 1900s, we did have more systematic things, but underwater, because of the inaccessibility, most people tried to direct how the salvage happened. But that, let's see if we can change the slide. Here we go. But that changed in the 1940s because we have the invention of scuba, which a lot of you might know. It's the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus that we use even today for scuba diving. And specifically the type known as aqualand that was invented by Émile Gagnan and Jacques Cousteau in 1942. And with this equipment, divers were not only allowed to go underwater safely, but they were also allowed to move freely. So they could actually do various activities like photographing, doing drawings, and taking notes. So suddenly in the 1950s, we have the start of a big underwater exploration with a lot of professional scuba divers who go around to basically look at the seabed all around the world. And because they're not only interested in marine like biology and the ecosystems that are underwater, they start also finding a lot of shipwrecks. And a lot of these professional scuba divers become amateur archaeologists. So they approach archaeological departments in various universities and they try to understand how to objectively record the material remains that exist underwater. And because of that, they also start some underwater excavations. But we do not have an actual archaeologist going underwater to record material remains until the 1960s. And that was George Bass. George Bass was a PhD student of archaeology and classics at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a prehistorian, so he was looking at civilizations around like 3,000 years before Christ. And he was invited by some of these amateur archaeologists who were doing some underwater excavation at the site of Cape Gelidonia shipwreck in Turkey. And he was mostly invited to study the pottery that they were retrieving from the wreck. But while he was there, he decided that it's actually worth it to learn how to scuba dive so that he can go to the site himself. And once he was there, he understood that he can actually apply all of the techniques and methodologies that he would use on land in the underwater environment. So George Bass started bringing a lot of his fellow PhD students and a lot of his colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania, start to train them to scuba dive and use all of the techniques from land in the underwater environment. And this way, the University of Pennsylvania had like the first academic maritime archaeological team, and they created the Institute of Nautical Archaeology that was based first at the University of Pennsylvania, and then they moved to Texas A&M University, which is one of the biggest and first academic maritime archaeological units. Similarly, in Britain, we have in the 1970s the archaeological excavation and the raising also of the Mary Rose shipwreck. The excavation happened in a very similar way to the Cape Caledonia and the University of Pennsylvania team. So a lot of archaeology students from the University of Cambridge started to learn how to scuba dive, and also a lot of archaeologists from the equivalent authority of historic England that existed in the 70s. And they did a full-on stratigraphic excavation. So they basically removed the soil of the seabed, like layer by layer, recording everything very accurately and very systematically. And a lot of the people who got part in this excavation then went to create the Centre for Maritime Archaeology at the University of Southampton, which is like the second biggest program of maritime archaeology and academic unit that existed. So as you can see, academic underwater archaeology happened quite later than the rest of archaeology, and it has quite a distinctive history and route that it followed to reach the methodologies that we use today. So today, maritime archaeology is not just underwater archaeology. As explained, the field did start from underwater, but after the 70s and especially in the 80s and 90s, a lot of academics working on the field tried to define what maritime archaeology is and what it includes. So nowadays, we basically define maritime archaeology as the field of archaeology that is concerned with the study of the sites and the material remains related to the human activities on, in, and around aquatic environments, including the seas, oceans, rivers, and lakes, and wetlands quite frequently. So maritime archaeology tries basically to examine how people lived with aquatic environments, not just like with the material remains that are underwater, but tries to get a more holistic view about how land and sea are combined for maritime communities and maritime populations from the past to the present. So maritime archaeology has the bit of underwater archaeology, which I explained, but we also look at nautical archaeology. So we study boats, the technology of them and how it evolved, how people used it, what sort of material they had for the construction of boats in various places and time periods. We also look at coastal and intertidal archaeology, how people lived in the coast, how especially also in intertidal coasts, and how that affected their lives, what sort of communications and connections they had, and things like that. We also have a really big subfield of maritime ethnography. So we use basically methodologies from anthropology and ethnography to study recent or contemporary maritime communities and maritime cultures, focusing on both the tangible heritage, like the things, the material culture that we can see, but also intangible heritage, including oral histories. And in order to interpret the material culture, we incorporate quite a lot of things from maritime history, because a lot of the archives inform on the material remains that we find. And also we use quite a lot of scientific methods as methods from geomorphology, geology, geography, in order to understand site formation processes and how various depositions of material remains happen. So as you can understand, maritime archaeology is very interdisciplinary, and depending on the site and the topic that you have, you might need to use various methodologies and practices. One of the earliest methodologies was to try to access material remains underwater, and that one of the first ways to do that would involve having diving archaeologists who would not just like go into the seabed and start removing things. We do not touch anything when we find things underwater. The practice is to go underwater and start to record by using photography. Right now, there's a lot of 3D modeling happening. In earlier times, people did extensive drawings of archaeological sites underwater before deciding to remove anything from the seabed. And because not all sites are accessible by humans for various reasons, including even like safety or funding. Quite frequently, we use and borrow methodologies from oceanography, and very frequently you'll see maritime archaeologists using oceanographic research equipment to record bathymetry that very frequently shows material remains underwater and mostly shipwrecks, and also the use of remote operated underwater vehicles is quite common nowadays, because again, it can provide a lot of the images and videos that then we can use to reconstruct what sort of material remains we have underwater. underwater excavations do happen and have happened for many years. And the excavation, as I explained, is the exact same as we would do on land. Of course, there are some limitations, and one of the first ones is that we cannot spend a very long time underwater. So unlike a land archaeological excavation where you can go from 9 in the morning and leave at 4, underwater you usually have only, like, depending on the depth of the site, like from 20 minutes to an hour to excavate. So you need to record what you're doing a lot better so that you can tell the next person that comes to take over from you what you've been doing. But the actual excavation is happening with the exact same tools, including trowels, mattocks, brushes that we would use on land. The big difference is that we also use airlifts and water dredges, which basically are big tubes that suck up the sediment that we have already excavated. So we do not have buckets and wheelbarrows to take the soil away once it's excavated. So we basically vacuum it out of the site. And of course, we need to use various scuba diving methods to lift any objects. And again, that depending on the depth, might need some special planning so that there's no specific damage happening to the material remains. But as I said, maritime archaeology is not only underwater. We work mostly, I would say, on coastal and intertidal sites. And for that, we use surveying equipments that we would use on land archaeology or in geography, including differential GPSs. And we try to understand how various sites evolve over time, what they show, how they might be impacted by various environmental factors, including storminess or even simply the changing tide that happens every day. And another thing we do is record boats. And again, for that, we use a lot of techniques from naval architecture. So we need to learn a little bit how to draw boats, what is the terminology of its part of the boat in order to understand how it was built, why it was built like that. Did it have to do with the availability of the local material, the local environment, such as the forests that the community had? Did that change over time? For example, if they started having connectivity with an area with better timber, did they start using that? And then did this change how the boats were constructed? So by studying the boats as an artifact, we try to understand basically how people interacted with the environment, the various connections they had. And another thing that maritime archaeology is really involved with is policy. Because of the first focus of the academic field to underwater environments, and because of the risks that these have, especially because of the lack of clear borders in the sea. So a lot of wrecks are not clearly in a specific country. They might be in international borders. They might be in borders of 2 or 3 countries that might not be very friendly with each other. It became very clear that people need to do something about it, especially because a lot of sites kind of attracted treasure hunters. And one of the big examples is the Titanic, that was basically looted and was not archaeologically documented or excavated. So from around the 70s and 80s, scholars started trying to think of what could be done for this big problem. And in 2001, the UNESCO 2001 Convention for the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage was created, which is a very big achievement for the field because it created specific guidelines about how underwater archaeological projects should take place. And to do that, UNESCO brought together basically scholars from all over the world, so from many different fields and regions. So it is kind of a agreed document for policy as the best practice from the whole field, from any country. So even though the UNESCO Convention is not approved and ratified from every country in the world, in academia, we consider that document as how underwater archaeology should be happening. So the field has been quite active in achieving kind of policy recommendations and basically recommending to countries how they should deal with their underwater cultural heritage. And another topic that is quite important for maritime archaeology is the museums and the representation of this material culture that has to do with the water to the public. A lot of museums in the past, especially if they were created before the 1960s, had quite a lot of nationalistic ideas that they presented, and they were rooted in maritime history and mostly naval achievements of specific nations. Maritime archaeology, because it was, as I said, created academically a little bit later after the Second World War, tried from the beginning to be quite different and tried to tell the story of people and human beings and how they live in a specific place. So we have a lot of museum studies on maritime archaeological remains and maritime projects on how to best tell that story to the audiences. And I have here an example of the Mary Rose Museum. I don't know if any of you have seen it. You have? Yes. So it's one of the most amazing museums because it is created to tell the story of the people of the boat, not about the battle that it was lost in. So the whole museum is built based on the 3 decks that has arrived from the ship, and all of the artifacts are presented at the exact level where they were excavated. So they put basically everything of where it was found. So here's the hull of the ship that was lifted from the seabed, and everything that was found here was put in this gallery. Everything that was found here was put in this gallery. So people not only get an idea of how people lived on the ship, but they also understand how the archaeologists actually worked to reveal that and how it was possible to help them interpret what the Mary Rose archaeological sites can tell us about people in that time period and that region. And another maritime museum that is trying to move away from this more this older, more traditional maritime historical approaches is the Museum of London Docklands that focuses quite a lot on how people lived in that area, and it tries to tell a lot the story of the slave ships that started from the Docklands there in London, and it has a lot of material culture to basically support the stories and goes a step beyond what a normal maritime museum would do. So I think I tried to give you a little bit of a background of the field and how interdisciplinary it is, but also the various interesting sectors that the discipline has tried to address. And because of all of the things that have been done, the interdisciplinarity, the focus on the humans living in specific environments, but also this sort of tendency to impact policy and have a clear understanding of how, like especially governments and the heritage services should deal with specific things. And it became quite easy and almost very obvious that maritime archaeology could actually do something during the climate emergency. Archaeologists and heritage practitioners in general try to identify various contributions we could have. And you see here the document from ICOMOS, the report on the future of our pasts, engaging culture, heritage, and climate action that basically try to highlight how heritage could contribute to climate change, climate action and climate resilience, but also how heritage could be impacted by climate change and how various heritage stakeholders and heritage managers should do something about it. But we also have archaeologists such as Hannah Flack, who is I would say, one of the first climate change archaeologists who was previously in Historic England. I think right now she's in National Trust. And she basically has been highlighting how archaeologists, with all of the techniques and storytelling that we have and this sort of deep time perspective that we can offer, we can actually help in the climate adaptation initiatives and sustainability initiatives. And even though not clearly stated, heritage is mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a Sustainable Development Goal Target 11.4 that recommends strengthening the efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. And this has been something that the archaeologists have been involved heavily in trying to identify both heritage at risk, but also various aspects of our research data that could be used to create more sustainable cities and communities. And the types of data that we create are also mentioned in the climate change 2022 IPCC report that states the significance of local and indigenous knowledge, which is basically the understandings and skills developed by individuals and populations which are specific to the environment that they live. And as archaeologists, this is what we've been doing. We've been basically trying to track how people lived in specific environments, why they made specific choices, how they interacted with themselves, with other communities, and the environment. So as archaeologists, we can offer quite a lot of input on local knowledge that has either still remained in specific communities or has faded or changed over time. So again, this is another sector that archaeology has been contributing. More specifically for maritime archaeology, quite in the same time as the rest of the field of archaeology, after mostly the Paris Agreement in 2015, a lot of academics and professionals came together to see how we can highlight specifically what the field can offer. And in 2019, the Ocean Decade Heritage Network was created, and this is part of the UN Ocean Decade. It addresses directly Sustainable Development Goal 14 about the life below water, but in the same time, it also addresses Sustainable Goal 13 about climate action and various other things, including the sustainable cities and communities that I already mentioned. Inspired kind of by the Ocean Decade Heritage Network, but also the various directions that I could see in the field of maritime archaeology. In my previous project, I tried to create a theoretical framework, showing basically how practically can we address these sustainable development goals and how we can specifically contribute to that. And the table will be explained. It's not very densely written, but basically, just to summarize it, I identified that maritime archaeology can, first of all, offer examples of how people interacted with the environment in the past and create these sort of deep time perspectives. We have the skills to understand and monitor how various aquatic environments impact material culture, what various types of water can do in the wood, in the stone, how a river can affect the settlement, how can a storm on the coast affect the settlement, obviously from the past or recent past, but we can extend that also to the present, especially because we have been monitoring the situation of a lot of archaeological sites and heritage sites around the world. And therefore, we can help protect and safeguard cultural heritage assets and sites that might be impacted by climate change. And as I explained, we do record in our data quite a lot of local, indigenous, and traditional knowledge that can be used for either initiating climate awareness or for basically informing policy and various other climate adaptation, climate resilience initiatives. So just now, I'm going to go through some examples of these contributions with specific projects or sites, just to highlight how that's possible. So here I have an example of how we can basically look at the human environmental past and try to understand how people interacted with the aquatic environment. These maps are from a little research project that I've been doing with Bryony and Hannah. We've been trying to track how we could understand flooding and flood risk management in medieval and post-medieval England just from the archaeological record that we already have. So I've been going through the various data that exist mostly on databases and online to understand where it's mentioned in the archaeological reports and various other data sets that flooding happened in the past. What sort of flooding was that? What sort of material remains we have for that? And in the left map, you can see basically all of the sites that I have identified as mentioning basically some sort of flood deposits or flood defenses, and a lot of them you might also see that coincide with the places that nowadays have various flood risks. And on the map on the right-hand side, you can see in green the floodplains and flood meadows that are recorded as historic. This was in the historic landscape characterization of historic England data sets. So these are historically known floodplains and flood meadows. And in red, you can see the flood defenses and the various water supply systems that quite frequently were also drainage systems. So again, if you notice some of the areas that are marked historically as known, these are very similar areas that today are quite frequently at risk from flooding. So through looking at this sort of material culture of the past that shows how people lived in a particular environment, we can identify areas that historically flood, especially if we compare it to contemporary data. We can try to record the damage and the socioeconomic effects that happened in the past, and again, try to compare it to what happens today. We can also try to figure out and interpret the various strategies that people used in the past and if they were successful or unsuccessful, and again, through that inform current ideas. And also we can compare the infrastructure, but also the ways of living that people had in the past and how that might have changed to today. And overall, by talking about these things, we can also help people get more familiar with the natural environment again. Another thing that I mentioned we can do is we can monitor how aquatic environments impact material culture. And we know nowadays that a lot of climate change impacts will damage buildings, will damage various infrastructures such as roads, harbors. And in archaeology, we already monitor that for specific archaeological sites. And here you can see, for example, the remains of a fishing vessel in the River Humble in the UK. That as a part of some projects in Southampton, we've been looking at the various monitoring that people did in 2008, and then we recorded it again in 2016, and we saw that after some extreme storms and the various changes in the actual river ingredients, a lot of the wood has been lost. So we already can monitor the various changes that climate change brings to material culture. And another thing is, of course, sea level rise. And again, as archaeologists, we've been monitoring things that have been getting submerged and going underwater. And that, again, can inform various modern contemporary issues. And of course, here in the East Riding of Yorkshire coast, we have the problem of coastal erosion and a lot of heritage stakeholders have already been monitoring how heritage is impacted by that. And you can see here the example of a Roman signal station at Filey that is experiencing very significant problems from coastal erosion. So as heritage professionals, we already do this monitoring, and we can also help inform other things beyond heritage with this sort of data information that we are collecting. And of course, we can also inform directly councils and stakeholders to protect specific heritage assets that might come under threat because of climate change. And I have here an example from Cottingham here in Hull. This is the Thwaite Hall that was apparently damaged by flooding in 2007. And according to the 2023 Heritage at Risk records of the Historic England, it's still facing various drainage problems. So the reason why they have been identifying that is because it's an important heritage asset for the community, and they can advise the local authorities to take that into consideration where planning various flood and alleviation measures. And I talked quite a lot about the significance of local indigenous and traditional knowledge and how we actually, especially maritime archaeologists, we do collect this data and we can help inform various climate resilience and sustainability initiatives. My project that Ed mentioned earlier at the University of Helsinki basically examined traditional boats, wooden boats that are built with local material in the coast of the Aegean Sea in Greece, as an element of how people interacted with their local environment. These boats have been built in the same way with empirical methods, no proper drawings or plans since the 18th century. And recently, especially since the 1990s, the numbers of these boats, but also the knowledge of how to build and use them has been fading. And that has coincided with the extreme problems with the environment that the Aegean residents have been experiencing. So my research tried to look at when the bond of people with the sea and the whole natural environment broke, and how the bringing back some of the traditions, both the tangible, like the actual material, but also the intangible knowledge, the local knowledge these people had, could potentially support better sustainable solutions for the residents of the Aegean Sea. And now with our community waterscapes project that we are currently doing at the University of Hull, we've been talking to residents of Hull to try to understand their relationship with water. In the summer, we did some workshops asking them to come and bring some of their water heritage, or heritage that it shows their relationship with water. And through these workshops, we were able to record not just specific places or landmarks or buildings in the city, but also a lot of oral histories, family histories, various things that are also intangible that basically connect people with the water. And through that, we do hope to try to revive and remind people of why water is important and how you can basically live best with water. And by talking about both the water as an element that can flood a city, for example, but also an element that brought very significant financial security in the city for many centuries because of the maritime and fishing industries that existed, we tried to create some better climate awareness. And we are cooperating actually with the Ocean Decade Heritage Network, and our project is part of the UN Ocean Decade in order to contribute basically to ocean literacy, but also various other initiatives, including restoring people's connection and marine identity. Which is actually the challenge 10 of the UN Ocean Decade. And it basically shows of how reminding people of all of these significant things that the water can bring to them, you can actually help them restore as a society the connection they have with the ocean. So overall, with my research, I try to use the past and all of these research that we do with archaeology, trying to understand how people lived in specific environments over a very long period of time. And I'm using all of this information to try to address current environmental and climate issues, but also the role of humanity and how people fit in that, how communities have played a role in the problems that we have, but also how they could do some steps to address them and improve the situation that we are experiencing right now. So that's my presentation for today.